Thanks everyone for joining in. Cynthia, you can kick off.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me loud and clear. Welcome to everyone to our two speakers today, Paul Holden and Feroz Kachalia. Welcome to all attendees, and thank you very much to Defend Our Democracy for hosting this webinar today. If one just looks at the title today, Zondo Commission 1 year on. Will the recommendations be acted upon? If I recall, I was one of the people who gave witness and testimony at the Zondo Commission, and I gave mine in 2019 already. Today, we are sitting at 2023. The period of July, which is the 11th of July today, is also the African Union's Anti-Africa Corruption Day. July is also Mandela Month, which this year, ahead of the 2024 elections, should bring into sharp focus the issue of ethical leadership. What kind of leadership is required for our country to counter corruption and state capture? And future state capture. This period, July, also marks 2 years since the July 2021 insurrection, which was linked to the arrest of our former President Zuma after failing to comply with a Concord order to appear before the Zondo Commission. And just a few days ago, trucks were set alight yet again on the N3 highway, with little apparent reason, reminding us that we should remain forever watchful over our democracy and should be speaking out against any attempt to cause chaos and instability, which we've seen before. It is in this context that we today reflect on the Zondo Commission's recommendations 1 year on. Whether there is any political will to change the systems that allow for the capture of the South African state, and what should we all be doing if there is an attempt to simply file the Zondo Commission recommendations away, put them into file 13, on some ignored shelf or some other dusty, dysfunctional government department. And this is what we're going to debate today. Welcome all. I would like to welcome Paul Holden, who is the author of 2 books, current one that I've just read, Zondo at Your Fingertips, which is really brilliant. Thank you, Paul, and The Armed Steel. And I would like to welcome Feroz Kachalia from NACC. I'm going to give a brief overview of both our speakers today, and then we will go into a discussion on what our thoughts are regarding the Zondo recommendations. So Paul Holden is the director of investigations of Shadow World Investigations. Paul gave extensive evidence to the Zondo Commission inquiry, focusing on the ways in which the Guptas laundered their ill-gotten loot. Paul's evidence is discussed in detail in Part 6, Volume 3 of the Zondo Commission report. Originally from Johannesburg, Paul has over a decade of experience investigating cases of grand corruption and corporate malfeasance, including those as senior researcher on both the book and film of The Shadow World. Paul has published these findings widely, including in 5 books, 2 bestsellers, and 2 books on South Africa's 1999 arms deal. The most recent of which is Indefensible, which tackles the myths that sustain the global arms trade. Paul has written widely in the media, including articles in The Guardian, Independent, and Daily Maverick. Along with Andrew and their colleague Henny van Veeren, Paul was named an anti-corruption champion and whistleblower of the year in 2015 in relation to the South African arms deal. Paul is also Network Fellow of the Safra Center of Ethics at Harvard University. Welcome, Paul. Paul, we will go into your questions, and then the next I will welcome Feroz, and we can start the program. Thank you. So to start off, Paul, your recent book, which is Zondo at Your Fingertips. Why was it important for you to write this book?
Yeah, hi. Thanks first to everyone for joining and for Defend Our Democracy for hosting. And also, Cynthia, I must say it's a pleasure to talk to you for the first time. Obviously, I write about you in Zondo at Your Fingertips, and I can't thank you enough. I think all South Africans do for your brave actions around SAA. So in terms of the book, I mean, the Zondo Commission is extremely important. It went on for 4 years, and I think that by the end of those 4 years, there was a degree of exhaustion with the process, a bit of fatigue. And then with the way in which the reports came out wasn't helpful. I mean, they're extremely long, they're very dense, they're almost 5,000 pages. And they came out in this very sort of bitty way where there were, reports were published, every month or so. They didn't come out in any sort of logical sequence, which is clearly because the Zondo Commission was publishing them as they were being completed. But what it meant was that I think we lost the moment of reflection and reconsideration that we could have had when the Zondo Commission reports came out. And I was very worried that because of their length, because of how dense they were, because of all of those factors, and just the fact that everybody's life is full with stuff that they have to do, and South Africa's politics is full of moments of crisis as well. I wanted to make sure that there was one place where ordinary people could understand what the Zondo Commission set about to do, what its findings were, and what solutions it suggested, so we could have a national conversation about the ways to understand how state capture happened and how to prevent it in future. I think at the heart of a lot of the work that myself and my colleague Andrew and everybody at SWI does is that we fundamentally believe that you cannot have functioning democracy if important information is really only the preserve of professional lawyers and legal pundits and journalists. And we think it's fundamental to democratic well-being that ordinary people can understand what happened to the Zondo Commission and have informed conversations about what it reflected and where it suggests we go forward. So that's the thinking behind the book.
Well, thank you for it. I found it certainly interesting and in a precise form to be able to read it and go to the separate parts. The next question I have for you is, what recommendations of the Zondo Commission needs to be implemented to address the structural issues that can, if we see out of the 10 that you cover in your book, what are those structural solutions, do you think, in your research that can add value to our country, that we can start seeing transformation?
Sure. I mean, I think that there's quite a few recommendations they make, and I sort of, not in the book, but in my own head, I've grouped them in different categories. One is amendments to the legal framework and sort of the principles of the way we apply the law in South Africa. Second is about how we create new institutions or reform institutions, make them work better. And the last thing is sort of Parliament and the constitutional architecture. And I think there's a very interesting debate to be had about which one of those we agree with and which ones we don't. And I have to say, before I mention those that I do agree with, there are some that I don't agree with, and I'll come to that maybe in a bit. But for me, the two really key suggestions that the Zondo Commission had, which I think link to each other, is one, the creation of this independent public procurement anti-corruption agency, which they shortened to PAPACA. I'm probably not going to use that. I'm just going to refer to it as the agency here. I mean, the idea behind that was to create this sort of vertically integrated system, an agency that deals with public procurement. So on the one hand, it'll provide the ability to train people in procurement law, provide policy advice, maybe even have a capacity to come in and assist different government bodies to say, we're struggling with this procurement, can you come and give us guidance of good practice? But then it also included an investigative function. And sort of the idea behind it would almost be to create a semi-permanent Zondo Commission which acts as a sort of a clearinghouse for corruption-specific allegations in relation to public procurement. And I think that would be a huge step forward. I mean, there's a lot of countries in the world where there are, because corruption is considered a priority crime, and because corruption is so threatening to the fabric of the states, they actually set up specific corruption-focused tribunals or courts. So in India, for example, there are courts just set aside for the CBI to bring anti-corruption cases. I think creating that sort of body would create institutional knowledge around procurement and anti-corruption, but also provide a really useful mechanism by which public procurement cases can be brought quickly and resolved quickly, and create a culture of constant accountability, which I think is really important. And what's linked to that, and I think is probably the second really key point, and I'm sure, Cynthia, you probably speak about it more knowledgeably than I can, is the Zondo Commission made a whole range of recommendations around protection for whistleblowers, about how the law could be amended, about how protections can be brought in, how there could potentially be funds set aside for the protection of whistleblowers, mechanisms through which whistleblowers who, if whistleblowers blow the whistle and there is a seizure of some assets or some assets are recovered, that they might get a portion of those proceeds. But what I thought was quite important about that is that the Commission saw the Independent Public Procurement Anti-Corruption Agency and that function of whistleblower protection working side by side, which I thought was quite an interesting idea. The idea being that the agency would also become the node through which whistleblower complaints could be handled. And I really like that idea, because I like the idea of there being a direct way in which a whistleblower can feed information into a system that is specifically handles the matter the whistleblower is talking about, which is corruption and procurement. So, as it currently stands, often when a whistleblower has to try and do the right thing, if they want to go to law enforcement of some kind, generally speaking, they have to go to the Hawks, which is a sort of a general purpose agency, right? Or just to the police. And you can approach, various different places in the state. But I think the idea of creating a specific place that receives whistleblower complaints so they can immediately act on them, I think is something to be commended and something to be thought about. There's two more that I think which were really important. The one was the idea of the creation of a standing appointment and oversight committee around the appointment of the leadership of SOEs, and making it a legal requirement. The ministers have to consult with that body, and that the process of interviewing for management positions in those bodies happens publicly, so the whole public can have confidence that the right people are being appointed, and that this body then has the power to ensure the minister can't do it. Because the Commission is very clear that when you look at state capture in South Africa, one fundamental part of it is that it happened because the Guptas and Jacob Zuma colluded to ensure the management of state-owned enterprises was corrupted. That people who were not suited for the positions were put into those roles, and of which there are sadly many, many examples. And Cynthia, I'm sure you've experienced some of those examples firsthand.
Yes.
Then there's the National Charter Against Corruption with a code of conduct, which I think is a good idea. But I do think that that the code of conduct needs to have bite. It needs to have proper legal effect. If you're going to have a code of conduct, there has to be some consequences for not abiding by that code of conduct. I don't think it's sufficient to just say acting outside of the code of conduct is unlawful and just leave it at that, because something that's unlawful without consequence, really, you're just sort of letting people get away with whatever they want. So I think that a National Charter Against Corruption with a code of conduct is a very good idea, but only if we can make sure it is actually applicable and that it is the means by which people can, face disciplinary charges or even some degree of comeuppance before the law. And then the last thing, which I think is really important, is they don't speak about it in very detailed terms, but they speak about the issue of enhanced transparency in public procurement. And I think that's really key. And one thing that I think that we could possibly think about doing is making the government commit to the idea of what they call the sort of the open data or the open government standard, which is a standard that's been adopted around the world in many different countries. And it's effectively a commitment that says every single procurement above a certain level, all of the information in that procurement will be made public. So to give you an example, if you're in the EU, there is this incredible system called, I'm trying to remember what it's called now, I think it's called Tender Portal or something along those lines, where every single tender issued by a European Union country above 5,000 euros, the advertisement for the tender is put up online, the framework for how the points are awarded is put up online, who oversaw that award, you can actually call the person who awarded the contract, you have their number, and then details about who won the award, how much they're going to get paid, how it's being monitored. And you have a system like that, I think you could guarantee a degree of accountability and openness in the way that we conduct our government. So those are some of the key recommendations. And obviously there's more we can discuss.
Yes.
But those, for me, this is the key ones I think that we could think about.
Great. Yes, it does come out with quite a few others like the deferred prosecution, etc. But we'll discuss that a bit later. I'd just like to raise another question with you about the Guptas. So what we've, as South Africa, we failed to extradite the Guptas, and more recently, the NPA faced a setback with regards to the collapse of its Nulani case. I'm not sure if you're aware of that in South Africa, but given the centrality of the role of the Guptas, do you think that there's still hope for holding them accountable? Bringing in the book?
So I think, I'm afraid I'm slightly cynical on this. I think it's incredibly important that civil society and everybody in South Africa demands that they're returned constantly. I think it is a non-negotiable that should be the attitude of the South African government. The South African government should be aggressively pursuing them. But I will say that I'm slightly concerned of how realistic that prospect really is, because they're based in Dubai, and Dubai has an absolutely awful history of extraditing people. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but what it requires, sadly in Dubai, the legal system there is incredibly opaque. It's very heavily politically influenced. Dubai itself sets itself up as effectively a tax haven around the world. And part of its offer is that it won't extradite people that easily. Really, so the only people who've been extradited in the past, and I know this because I actually investigated one of those people who was extradited and spoke to them on the phone the day before they were extradited, is that it requires constant and repeated political pressure. That is the only thing that will convince authorities in Dubai to act. So on the one hand, I think it's absolutely fundamental that we always push for the South African government to push for that and to pursue every legal avenue and to raise it through every diplomatic channel. But I don't think that we should hang all of our activist work and our accountability work on the idea that the Guptas are going to come back. I also think there is something to be said about how there has been some degree of accountability already, because there have been so many assets of the Guptas that have been seized, which I think is helpful. And there's still quite a lot more to be done about that. There's still a lot more court applications which are ongoing. But for me at this point, I think strategically, it's incredibly important for us to start thinking about how we go about prosecuting other individuals implicated in state capture and other corporations who are implicated in state capture, because that's what I think is really missing at this point, is a real understanding of how we can go after those, particularly those European countries and companies that were engaged in state capture and how they've not been brought to book. I think that's a really key issue. So in terms of our activist approach and what we require of people, I think we have to slightly moderate this idea that we need to wait for the Guptas to come and then stuff can get going. I think we need to get going with other stuff on the understanding that it'll only be really sustained political pressure that will bring the Guptas back.
Yes. Now, I definitely agree with you. If I just think of my case, for instance, at SAA, I attended the Zondo for all the SAA presentations and testimonies. And I was there when Ms. Yake Kwanana gave her testimony and Ms. Dudu Mayeni gave her testimony. Batolo Ramasubudi, who worked for SAA and for AXA and then for Transnet. And it's like, they are there. Why are we not prosecuting them yet? We've got the evidence. So for me, I feel we should go for all the low-hanging fruit and work in the background for the others. Thank you very much, Paul. I have a fourth question for you, but I want to hold that because I'd like to ask the same question of Feroz. So Feroz, I would like to welcome you and bring you into the conversation now. So Feroz Kachalia is a South African lawyer and politician who was a member of the Gauteng Executive Council from 2004 to 2010. Formerly an anti-apartheid activist in the Transvaal, and he first joined the Gauteng Provincial Legislature in 1994, representing the African National Congress, and he served as a Speaker of the Provincial Legislature from 1999 to 2004. After that, he left the government, the provincial government, and was appointed as a law professor at Wits University. And from 2022 is now the chairperson of the newly formed National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council. Welcome, Feroz. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I have a few questions for you to answer, obviously, and I would like to make it sort of certain recent events, bring it for both you and Paul. So we'll start off first with the current work of the NACC, which is the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Forum. Who is on the forum? What is its scope? And what has it managed to achieve thus far? Because I know you guys have been doing a lot of work behind the scenes. And if you can just give us a good summary of what you've currently achieved. Thank you, Feroz. You're on mute. We unmute you.
Oh, okay. Good evening, Cynthia. Paul, I've just read your book, or I'm reading it. And good evening to all the participants on this platform. The National Anti-Corruption Council was established for about 8 months ago, pursuant to an anti-corruption strategy that was negotiated with civil society over a period of time and adopted by the cabinet 2 years ago. This strategy's basic assumptions are ones that I share quite strongly about what is required in what I think is going to be, if we understand the nature of systemic corruption, is going to be a long-term continuous battle without any quick fixes. So even while we have a sense of quite properly of urgency, we need to understand that an anti-corruption strategy is one that has many different interrelated prongs. Now, the all government and all society approach implicit in that idea is, first of all, that we have to look at the anti-corruption architecture as a whole. That includes, but is not exhaustive of, the criminal justice institutions. The ones primarily that we have been looking at are the Hawks, the SIU, the MPA, and the ACTT, which is a coordinating body. And there the questions are about, I think, about how to strengthen their capabilities, improve their skills in how these structures are governed, in order to ensure that investigations and prosecutions of high-level, complex crime, which includes organized crime and high-level corruption. Now, I think that over the last 2 years, there's been some significant improvement in the functioning of these bodies, but nowhere near what is required if we are going to be successful over the long term. And that's not limited to the recommendations or the findings of the Zondo Commission in fighting corruption. I think there's a need for criminal justice reform. We need to look at the rules of evidence, the procedural rules, as well as the skills that are required for our prosecutors and investigators to succeed against well-resourced individuals who are engaged in complex legal machinations, including cross-border relationships to launder money, for instance. So that's the one box that we're looking at as part of this all society, all government approach. But we're also looking at prevention, which is, in my view, receiving insufficient attention in the public debate. In our work in the National Council of Provinces, in the National Council, we're paying a lot of attention to what we're calling systemic corruption, which requires that we establish institutions. And we do have an existing institution which has some of these capabilities, the SIU, that has the ability to go into an institution, investigate patterns in the way of their finances, the way they procure goods and services, and so forth, to identify corruption, potential corruption proactively, and where there is such evidence, perhaps to refer that evidence to the law enforcement agencies. It's rather similar to the proposal of the Zondo Commission to establish an independent anti-corruption procurement agency, but I would say, without us having come to a specific conclusion on that matter, that it might well be that, we certainly need a specific focus on procurement fraud, but corruption takes many forms, and an anti-corruption agency perhaps should have a broader mandate. So that's perhaps one of the first questions that we, Paul and I, can perhaps have a discussion on. It should perhaps include, we are doing a lot of work on whistleblowing, as you know, Cynthia. I can indicate that the Department of Justice, and we did for a while have some challenges engaging with the department, but those appear to have been resolved. As far as I can tell, from recent information and documents submitted to us by the department, considerable progress has been made by the department on legislative proposals, including institutional changes. So we've been looking at, whether we need to establish a separate institution, or whether any new anti-corruption agency that we establish should have its mandate whistleblowing protection as well. So that's something we're looking at. We do have a working group on whistleblowing. We have a second working group on procurement. We have a third working group on legislative reform, and I've made some reference to legislative reforms which I think we should be looking at in the criminal justice cluster. And then a working group headed by David Lewis on the architecture, where we are looking at the institutional architecture, including the proposals that have come out of the Zondo Commission, but we do not consider ourselves, we're giving those proposals thoughtful and careful consideration, but we have not come to conclusions about how the institutional architecture should be restructured. We don't want to rush that decision. We want to ensure that it's properly substantiated with evidence. And we're also taking a lot of time to examine our current institutional architecture so that we, in a sense, can design institutions which are appropriate for the South African context and experience.
Thank you for that comprehensive background, Feroz. I have another question, and then I'm going to bring Paul Holden in, and then we can start sort of having a similar discussion in taking this forward regarding the Zondo Commission recommendations. So what I've, in your presentation now, you'd mentioned that you are covering the whistleblowing, which covers in the recommendations together with procurement, legislation, and then the architecture. Are you also looking at the electoral reform which also comes out in Zondo Commission? Is NACC looking at that at all?
So let me just just make a quick point that I think I should have made, which is that the Zondo Commission's proposals, broadly speaking, fall into two categories. There are proposals for investigation and prosecution of individuals, and then there are institutional suggestions for institutional restructuring. We are focused on the institutional architecture, not so much on questions of whether or not individuals who should be prosecuted have been. There again, our focus is much more on capabilities, on strengthening the capabilities of those institutions. Now, on your specific question, I think we should go back first of all to the strategy, this all government, all society strategy that was adopted to identify what the scope of our work is, the scope of our mandate. And it raises a question also about what we mean by corruption. I would strongly encourage a debate on those questions. I personally think that the Zondo Commission's definition is partly correct, but also limited. And the reason that that's an important question is that it goes not simply to the scope and mandate of the work of the NACC, but the question, what remedies are required to fight corruption? If you think about corruption purely as a legal phenomenon or in terms of criminality, it limits your conception of what the remedies are, because then the focus simply becomes prosecution and investigation of individuals. We haven't looked at electoral reform. I don't think that it sort of, on any interpretation, it falls within our mandate. But we are looking at political party funding. And I think that civil society should be vigilant there because we have important legislation that was adopted. And now there are efforts by political parties to introduce amendments and so forth. And I think we should be very careful about that, because political party funding is definitely one vehicle for not simply for bribery, which is a form of criminality, but the peddling of improper influence, the capture of democratic institutions and political processes. So we are taking a fairly broad view of our mandate to include party funding, but it's not so broad as to include electoral reform.
Thank you very much.
Although let me just say that obviously, and this is a question that just as Zondo quite properly raises, it's the functioning of our parliament. If you have a representative body which doesn't hold our elected politicians, particularly those that have executive authority, accountable, you have state capture. That's the lesson, in a sense, of our experience over the last decade.
And that actually brings me to the question I want to ask both of you now. So I'm posing the same question to both Paul and yourself, Feroz. A year now after the Zondo report has given their final recommendations, do you think there is political will to implement the recommendations in, I know we've got NACC on the one side, we've got civil society working on various areas. We've even got civil society working on the electoral reform, because I'm aware of that. And we also aware that there's areas done around the whistleblowing sphere in resolving the whistleblower challenges that we're facing in our country. So and recently we've also had our Department of Justice release a discussion document on whistleblowing. So just to ask, do you think there is political will to make sure those recommendations are enforced, implemented, and ensured that they become something that the South Africans can start holding others accountable? Thank you.
Paul, do you want to go first?
I was going to defer to you first. Why don't you go first, and then I'll jump in.
Okay, so political will, the international kind of experience is absolutely clear. Political will is one of the essential elements, but I want to stress that it's only one of the essential elements of a successful anti-corruption strategy in any jurisdiction. I think that we are in a moment where important political resources in the presidency, in the governing party, in opposition parties, in civil society, are in the process of being mobilized for what I have to say is going to be a long-term fight. Now, we also have, and we have to be realistic about this, one of the lessons, I think, of what outcomes of the Zondo Commission, but we knew this before the Zondo Commission investigated this and produced all this evidence, is that one of the key components of corruption is what I would call political corruption. Corruption by people, it's what's called entrusted power, or sometimes called entrusted power, but people in high office, in positions of power and authority, who are abusing a public office. Now, it's not limited. Those are not the only dramatis persona we should be focused on, and I'm sure that Paul and I are going to have an interesting debate about that, or discussion about that, because he raises some important questions in his book about the private sector. But let's just stick to this notion of political corruption. Now, everywhere where people who hold political office, and often legitimate political office because they're elected, will themselves seek to undermine anti-corruption efforts. And so I think we've got to acknowledge progress. We've got to work with positive forces in the government and in civil society, but recognize that we are not acting in the interests of those who are benefiting from corruption. And many of the people who benefit from corruption hold political office. So to your question, whether there's political will, I don't think it's an either or question or either or answer. I think that one of the great achievements of the Zondo Commission is that it has provided us with the evidence, with the momentum, with the ability to mobilize society, with the mobilize the positive forces in the political process to undertake this important struggle against what is now systemic corruption. We're not just dealing with a few discrete individuals, and we're not just dealing with the Guptas. I think there's another way in which the framing of state capture is too narrow. There are forms of corruption that have got nothing to do with the individuals identified in the Zondo Commission, and that's as alarming as worrying.
Indeed. Thank you, Feroz. Do you want to add your part in, is there political will? What do you see us going forward now with the recommendations of the Zondo state capture?
Sure, thanks. For us, I think it's a very interesting answer to say neither yes nor no. I mean, I think that there's a lot hidden behind that question, is there political will? There's a whole series of assumptions that I think we should interrogate about what creates political will, who holds political power, why they hold political power. What I will say is that I think that there is a huge amount of political will amongst ordinary people and civil society for something to happen. I think that's undoubtable. That there is a very clear sense, I think, amongst most South Africans that there is something fundamentally wrong that happened with state capture, and something fundamentally wrong threatens to take over the state again. So there is a reservoir of political will that exists within, I think, ordinary South Africans who are mostly horrified by the scale of corruption and the waste that occurs, and see how on a day-to-day basis it makes their lives worse. It makes their lives harder, it makes them poorer, it makes their education worse. So I think that there is that reservoir of political will that exists and always exists. The question then becomes, how do you take that political impetus and make sure that our elected officials actually do what the public wants? And I think that's something that what's really behind this idea of is there political will? Because I think realistically within the state, I think within all levels of the state, but also within the private sector as well, it's very factionalized, it's very bifurcated. There are places where they do want corruption to be dealt with, and there are places they don't. I think we're living in a very particular moment now, I think very fortunately, where we have a presidency that in general terms supports movements towards this, and that's an incredibly powerful institutional backer of this process. But what I think needs to be discussed more clearly is about what can we do to ensure that political pressure on those political representatives doesn't abate at any stage, that they suffer serious consequences, whether it's in terms of reputation, their political position, and eventually potentially prosecution for supporting corruption or preventing the implementation of recommendations that reduce it. That for me is really the key question we need to be digging into. How do we empower people to ensure that their public officials do what they're supposed to do? And then the question of political will becomes a very different question, I think. How do we actually translate the popular will into political action?
Exactly, and that's the question I have next, is that what role can the public play? What can they do in holding government accountable to those implementations, not only of the Zondo Commission recommendations, but the systemic corruption that we're seeing in our country? Feroz, have you got a response to that one?
Yeah, I've got some strong views about that. So I want to go back to this idea of an all society, all government approach.
Mm-hmm.
One of the pillars is citizen participation. Now, this is a critically important pillar of any successful anti-corruption strategy. I think, and I hesitate somewhat because we haven't come to firm conclusions yet, but any new anti-corruption agency that we establish should have included in its mandate engagement with stakeholders, engagement with civil society, the mobilization of civil society. I have this idea perhaps that the new Anti-Corruption Commission should be able to convene popular assemblies It should certainly have the capabilities to receive and act on complaints, which will assist its investigative work, anti-corruption complaints. It should probably have some decentralization of its structures, you know, not just in Pretoria, so that ordinary people can lay complaints through a variety of platforms, can go to an office, and so forth and so forth. So I want to get away to some extent from this idea that we've got a problem with bad criminals, individuals who need orange overalls, and we have a lack of political will as an explanation for why we have state capture and systemic corruption and what is required to fight corruption. So let's start to think about institutions. Let's start to think about structures. Let's start to think about capabilities. And I'm making the point in response to your question, Cynthia, that if we recognize that changes of behavior, the mobilization of citizens, citizen participation, you know, I'm in Kenya at the moment. We're visiting various institutions, and I'm learning a tremendous amount. But they've been at this for much longer than us, maybe 20 years. You know, I listened to a very senior judge today, made a wonderful speech, you know, making the point that in this battle, if you like, between good and evil, what we got to make sure about is that the public is on the side of the good. And we've got to recognize that we have behavioral and cultural issues, perhaps. I mean, there are ways in which corrupt behavior is defended, is supported by members of the public. I mean, we have politicians who have misbehaved, who are elected by our voters. You know, we have when certain politicians appear in court, there are people who are mobilized to defend them. So the issue is broader than political will. It's about taking a long-term view, a strategic view, which includes a strong focus on education, on prevention, on public engagement, on public mobilization, and so forth. Then we will win the battle against people who don't have any interest in the fight against corruption, because their interests are served by corruption.
Thank you for that, Feroz. The next question, I think we're still on track for time, is a recent event happened in our country, and I'd like to pose the question again to both of you, just to get your views on this. Just recently, Chief Justice Raymond Zondo criticized Parliament for failing to implement the recommendations of the Commission that he chaired. And do you concur with him when he made that statement? And is Parliament currently failing to address the previous and new forms of state capture and corruption, and the potential lack of accountability that we are seeing now in the executive? Thanks.
Paul, do you want to take that first, or? I mean, I'm happy.
You go ahead first, for us. I like coming in after you, if I can.
So I'm a great admirer of Justice Zondo. I think he's done a great service to the country. Now, the question is whether his criticism of Parliament is well-founded. On the institutional side, like, you know, his proposal, for instance, to set up an independent anti-corruption procurement institution, I think that if that's and the fact that we don't have one yet if that is included in his assessment, then I would say that I respect his sense of urgency, but the complex task of restructuring, redesigning, renewing our institutional architecture is going to take time appropriately. We've got to get this right. There's no formula, there's no blueprint. I can't come to Kenya and say, okay, they've got an anti-corruption and ethics agency. They've also got, by the way, they've got an act. All we need to do is to copy what they have done because they appear to be doing reasonably well. So that's not going to work. We need an evidence-based, carefully researched proposals that have to be realistic in the sense that they build on what the current institutional framework. So that's going to take time, and I mean we've got 3 years. The council. I'm hoping to have at least some proposals in this regard for consideration before the next election. And I hope that we can achieve that, but it's going to be a tall order. As far as his frustrations about, you know, the fact that there are a number of people against whom findings were made, individual findings were made about what I would call quid pro quo corruption, recommendations of investigation and prosecution. And he expressed, if he's expressing some frustration about inadequate progress, because I think there's been some progress there, I think he's expressing the national sentiment. But again, excuse me, I think the key questions are going to be, once we get beyond the blame game, which I think, you know, I think is important. Mm-hmm. Once we get against the blame game, what do we need to do to strengthen the capabilities of the MPA, the SIU? And by the way, those institutions are now, I can tell you, this is my view, they are headed by ethical, highly capable professionals. I've got a lot of confidence in them. And I think that to the extent that their performance is inadequate, it's got to do with resources, with budgets, with in relation, you know, to the task at hand. As regards his comments on Parliament, I think that again I share his frustrations. Parliament is not, for many years, has not, I think, functioned in accordance with constitutional framework and ideals. Mm-hmm. Although there are many people, you know, I think in Parliament who are trying their best. But I think that if we're going to win the fight against corruption over the long term, the way Parliament functions is an important question. And I don't think they should be overly sensitive when there's criticism from a more senior judge. They've got to do better.
Thank you. It gives me comfort what you're saying right now, that our SIU NPA and are headed by extremely ethical people and willing to get the job done. So that does give me comfort. Thank you, Feroz. Paul, would you like to give your comments? Thank you.
Sure. I don't have a huge amount to add to what Feroz said. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that it's extremely frustrating that you have people in Parliament who clearly shouldn't be there. And I think one of the things that, you know, that the Zondo expressed an extraordinary amount of frustration with is about the standards at which we held our political leaders and sort of the threshold of the bar at which consequences become enforced. So he has this incredible discussion about the ANC's internal disciplinary discussions about how they've handled allegations of corruption. And he says, very importantly, he says, what has happened to the movement? What has happened to the ANC? That the bar for somebody not being allowed to stand is that they've been convicted of a criminal offense. Like the idea that is the only point in time in which you can discipline an ANC member or an ANC MP is insane. And he says, very rightly, he says in his report, that there's so much overwhelming public evidence against certain individuals like Mosebenzi Zwane, that the idea that you have to wait for that matter to come to court and potentially take 10 years to go through court in order to take action against them based on what's publicly known is just an insane approach. This idea of disciplining MPs, of making sure the best MPs are in Parliament, is not a judicial process. It's not a process that has to go through a criminal court. There are other mechanisms by which you have disciplinary hearings that aren't court processes where these sort of things can be aired. So I understand his frustration with the fact that nothing has been done about people like Zwane, who still sit in Parliament and draw a salary and sit on committees and make statements that are really just utterly unacceptable. I mean, in terms of hard outcomes, I mean, the key things that Zondo focused in on when it came to Parliament was this idea of a mandatory accountability, which I have to admit, before I read the report, I hadn't heard for a very long time in South African political discourse. It was something that was very big and a huge part of our constitutional discussion back in the late 90s and early 2000s, when effectively it was all sort of sidelined by the extent of corruption and our national conversation became very different. But the idea there is very simple, is that actually when you look at the law and you look at the way power manifests in South Africa, if Parliament makes a finding, a remedial finding against the presidency or against government, it actually has no force in law. The government can just ignore it. The president can actually just ignore it. So Parliament becomes a mechanism through which you can conduct oversight, you can ask questions. When it comes to actually making recommendations on the executive, they don't have any force in law. And there is no ability for Parliament to force the government or force the presidency to amend its prior conduct where it's fallen foul of Parliament's committee's findings. So I think, when Zondo speaks about his frustration, I think he's speaking both about the fact that there isn't a movement on people like Zwane and others, but I think he's more fundamentally concerned about the fact that we're not even having the conversation about that issue, which he spent a lot of time discussing. I don't think, as far as I understand, and I could be mistaken, the issue of a mandatory accountability hasn't even been raised in Parliament since the Zondo Commission came out. So you can see the level of his frustration and why that hasn't, that doesn't pass muster with him. And I have to say I'm very sympathetic with him. So I think that there is, a part, again, it's a discussion we need to have as civil society, is how do we force our political representatives to have that discussion and start moving that forward in Parliament?
Exactly. Thank you for that. So we have our constitution, we have the PFMA, which is the Financial Public Management Act. There's the MFMA, which is on the municipality side, and then there's PRECA. And if one looks at all the findings, through each part of the Zondo Commission report, he specifically states what they've done and where they've contravened certain legislation. And in your book, your summary that you put, Zondo, at your fingertips, you have at the end of each of your chapter, you actually list that. So for me, that's an easy tool to use to start holding people accountable because it's there. So we need to start seeing that. And I think maybe this is the role that citizens in South Africa can play to start asking and challenging the accountability. Okay, so we've come to
can I make a...
You're welcome.
So I want to pick up on a point I was trying to make earlier, and it's sort of triggered by something Paul said. So I drew a distinction between, I asked, what do we mean by corruption? I think one way to think, I would say that corruption is not limited to illegal behavior. It includes unethical behavior. And that raises the question about standards in public life. Now, currently, Parliament doesn't have a reliable system for ensuring that parliamentarians comply with the standards that are expected of those who hold public office. They have a system in which they have an ethics committee, and they have some kind of code of conduct which has no bite. It's headed by officials who are employees of Parliament. We need not only stronger legislation, but rethink this whole area of standards in public life. In the UK, they have some kind of parliamentary ombud with enforcement powers who's independent of Parliament. Now, I don't know if the new institutions we're talking about should include this ethical component, or whether we should have something like a parliamentary ombud, but that's an important question. Secondly, why is it, I mean, political parties have to be challenged because they keep, I mean, the way they select candidates for public office, for positions in Parliament, in legislatures, local government, those standards have been dropping consistently over the last 2 decades. So the issue that Justice Zondo is raising and expressing frustration about is an entirely legitimate one. The remedies are not entirely clear, but we need to think creatively and innovatively about what we can do to ensure that the people who are elected into important positions have the requisite values and so forth to carry out their responsibilities. So as long as you have a situation where people who are tainted, have political power, are elected repeatedly into high positions in political parties and then into Parliament and so forth, we're never going to get to a position where the public has confidence in our democracy, confidence in our leaders. So I think that's a big question, and it's a political question. It's one that, you know, you can't over-regulate political parties. How do you ensure that they select the right people? But I think it needs to be an important part of the conversation going forward.
Thank you for that, raising that issue, Feroz, together with Paul Holden talking about the standards. So for me, the principle of just having values, standing by those values, and ensuring that they are ethical and that we are following some sort of moral pathway. And we've seen in our country the degeneration of our morals, the personal values. When I read the Zondo report and the decisions certain people made in key positions, they were executives, yet they made decisions that did not at all have the best interest of the organization they needed to take care of and follow their fiduciary duties. And on top of it, they missed the key values of being moral about issues and being ethical and upholding that ethical standard. And yes, I've seen in our whole fabric of society, we're seeing it in the gender-based violence, we're seeing it in what's come out with the Estina dairy farm. We've seen it with the way in each of the cases on the Zondo Commission. We're currently seeing it still perpetuated in where we are now with 2 years ago, the violence that happened with July 21, and just recently now, yesterday, where cars are still being torched, and there's no reason given. So what right does someone have to do harm to another? So we're losing our basic values as human beings. And that for me is the hardest. If we can start getting back to basics of who we are as humans, maybe we can start changing the trajectory of our country. So thank you for that. I would like to open questions to all our attendees and participants in this webinar. You're welcome to ask any questions, and we'll see if our speakers, Feroz and Paul, can answer them for you. And here you can have the debate as a citizen, asking, what can I do to make a difference in our country? And I believe that if we all stand together, South Africans, we can start making that difference. So I'm opening the floor to any questions. I'm going to read in the chat to see if there's any questions so long and just go through that. And
there was a
cool.
question about, I think the first question was about whether we need independent institutions. So the proposals that came out, out to some extent out of the Glenister judgments was for the establishment of an independent anti-corruption agency. But it appeared to be implicit in that proposal that the focus should be on an anti-corruption agency which is focused on the criminal justice cluster, as opposed to prevention, for instance, citizen participation, and so forth. Now, my preliminary thoughts, because the council hasn't come to conclusions yet, would be that we need to strengthen the independence of the SIU, the Hawks, and the MPA, especially the NPA, among the steps that need to be taken, the Department of Justice has introduced or is about to introduce proposals to strengthen the independence of the Independent Directorate, which they're proposing to make a permanent body. That set of proposals has the support of the criminal justice cluster of the MPA. I think that it will be an important step forward. As far as the second Glenister judgment wasn't prescriptive about what kind of agency we need. What I would suggest is that there needs to be a careful debate about what kind of institution we need and what kind of powers it should have, and so forth. My own view at the moment is that its main function would be to focus on prevention, and I do think which is systemic corruption. So it will have powers of it should have powers of investigation, for instance, even search and seizure, perhaps. Civil forfeiture. So it won't be a toothless body, and it should be, I think, independent of the executive branch. And it might well be that it should be given a constitutional status, although I think our experience, again, over the last 10 years has shown that, merely establishing a Chapter 9 institution is not always a panacea. But giving the body, either establishing a Chapter 9 institution or giving it some kind of constitutional status, for reasons that I'm happy to discuss now, I don't know if there's time, but I think there's some merit in the idea that it should have constitutional status, which means, that will have an impact on appointments, on removal, on budgets, and so forth.
Thank you for that, Rose. Can I go to, I'm just going to the page to see if there's any questions on the chat page that I could pose to you guys regarding. So I'm going to read, there's not questions as such, but there's comments. I'm going to just read them and I'm going to move backwards, which makes it easier for me. Roof Pretorius says that regarding the decisions of the officials, if it is about officials of SOEs, it speaks to the principles deficiency of cadre employment, which is true. Once you lose the values and principles, and the fact that we only hire in the cadre deployment, then there's no longer a reason to uphold any principles and values. Going to read something else. Roof Pretorius also adds, did Zondo make a mistake in involving the Chief Justice? Sorry, I'm just not sure if I'm getting it correct. In Zuma and the Guptas are guilty. It means, I'm sure, that we all share the belief that they are, but the Chief Justice words carry a certain weight that others' words don't carry, and it may compromise the cases against them. But this is completely separate from his criticism against Parliament, of course. So that's just a statement, if anyone wants to respond to that. I couldn't read if I just bring it down properly. Yeah, okay. There's a new message that's just come in around the Glenister rulings. Glenister, so there's a question from Paul Hoffman. He says, Glenister case rulings are not proposals. Our highest court has laid down binding criticisms. I'm just trying to open it a bit so I can read it. Our highest court has laid down binding criteria for any institution established as a consequence of the reasonable decision of Parliament. Does NACC understand the legal position so created? This question is for you, Feroz.
Yes, I'm very happy to engage with Paul, who's done some tremendous work and who sends me emails very often. Let me put it this way. There is no question that our proposals have to comply with constitutional prescripts, and it's the Constitution then as interpreted by the courts. So those criteria for independence that I have made some reference to about removal, independence from the executive branch, appointments and so forth, have to be complied with. Paul is absolutely correct about that. But respectfully, I think that Paul's specific proposals, that we want to engage him. I think he should adopt an open mind, because these are complex questions. I think his proposals ignore issues of prevention, of citizen participation, of systemic corruption, because it's a paradigm that is driven entirely by the erroneous idea, I think, that corruption is equivalent to criminality. And so their focus then becomes the law enforcement agencies, investigation and prosecution of individuals. That all occurs after the fact, and that is in a sense already too late. So he should have give us the opportunity as NACC, keep an open mind, give us the opportunity to make proposals. We will engage with him and others on the proposals that we make, and amend them where necessary in the light of the representations that we receive. But I would say to Paul, there isn't one formula, there isn't one kind of institution which is a panacea, which is without doubt the right answer to a complex problem. I'm in Kenya at the moment, as I indicated. They have an anti-corruption agency, which includes a mandate to deal with ethical lapses. They have an administrative justice agency, which includes freedom of information. We have a different system. Our freedom of information regulator is separate, is a separate institution. Australia has just adopted legislation to establish an anti-corruption agency. By the way, it took them 20 years. We don't have 20 years, but that agency is not focused exclusively on the criminal justice cluster, and there's a strong anti-preventative mandate. So I am confident that we are going about this task carefully, systematically, with research, supported by research. We're going to produce proposals on which we will engage with you, Paul. But give us the opportunity to do that. I am expressing some skepticism about your specific proposals, which I've done with you, privately. But you can be assured that we will produce proposals which are grounded in constitutional values, which are consistent with the Glenister judgments, because those judgments are a response to our experience. And our experience has been that, you can't leave anti-corruption agencies under political control. So I can tell you now that we will not produce proposals that we are thinking carefully about how to avoid state capture 2.0. And I would say that maybe I'm going on a bit, but the lessons of the Zondo Commission is clear, and history preceding the Zondo Commission. The disbandment of the Scorpions, for instance, interference in the investigation, prosecution of high-level corruption. We don't want a repeat of that. We want to learn lessons from our past and avoid them.
Thank you, Feroz. Advocate Paul Hoffman has said that he's very happy to engage. And he also says the definition of corruption in PRECA is very wide, and the problem in the criminality that is abroad in SA among the corrupt because they enjoy impunity at present. However, he's happy to engage. Rolf Pretorius says this is not where the public protector's job comes in. I know there is a problem with Makwabene, but in a few months she's going to be gone away, and hopefully we'll have a proper PP in place that's going to be installed. So it's just a statement because he's about to leave. Let
me just respond to that quickly, Cynthia, because it raises. You see, so we also have overlapping mandates. If we look at the anti-corruption institutions that we have, the public protector clearly has some role in fighting corruption. And by the way, so is our constitutional court, our court. So we have to think carefully about how to structure institutions which have defined mandates, but which also complement each other.
Indeed. Thanks. Then I have some comments, one from Lorraine Ibrahim. She says, definitely more public participation is required in SA to fight corruption. In order to offer a remedy, the root cause of anything needs to be addressed. More support and protection for whistleblowers, as well as more open awareness. And then from Pumla Williams, she states, what the state capture inquiry exposed and more of the corruption acts that continue to be exposed by media dispels the myth peddled in government that red tapes and bureaucracy are the responsible for slow service delivery program. Corruption happened with PFMA and its regulation in place. People just perfected ways of doing corruption within those red tapes, which is very true. We just need to strengthen the accountability on those who commit crime. South Africans want to see people facing the music once found to have robbed our taxpayers. Thank you for that, Pumla. Let's see the next, if there's any more questions or statements. Jeremy Stevenson says, given that elected politicians are and sometimes likely to oppose anti-corruption efforts, it is not absolutely essential to establish an anti-corruption agency with Chapter 9. Is it not? With Chapter 9 status. Can you indicate where NACC stands on the establishment of such a body, please? I'm not sure if you covered that in your previous, but you can take that question, Feroz.
Well, I think I've tried to cover that question, but if the questioner wants to, ask me a follow-up question along those lines, I'm happy to respond. I mean, so we are in agreement that we need a constitutionally independent body, or at least a body that is independent of the executive branch, precisely because one of the elements of corruption is political corruption. But, we haven't had a discussion on an issue that Paul Holden raises very sharply in his book. It should be part of the discussion, but it's the interface between the private sector, private agents, and public officials. And that whole area, I think he quite rightly complains that the Zondo Commission left out of its investigation. When we have more time, I'm happy to explore what I think is an important question that Paul has raised.
Yes, great. Thank you then for that. I have another question from Anwar stating, should we include moral and ethical training in our education system as part of our curriculum? Open to both Paul and Feroz.
So absolutely. I mean, just because I've been talking about prevention, so that's why I think that this new anti-corruption agency, if it's focused on prevention, so it would also have a sort of policy and legislative mandate. And one of the areas that such a body would then engage, say, with the Department of Justice, sorry, the Department of Education, on incorporating ethical content, anti-corruption content, behavioral content at school level. I think even universities have an important role to play, because at the end of the day, I think high levels of corruption do suggest, does raise moral questions about personal ethics, personal behavior, personal restraints. I've been interested here in Kenya, that they're quite a religious society. All the meetings, their references to the many faiths that but the focus then is very much on moral restraints, on so there's a limit to what institutions and structures can do. We also need to change behavior, and so that's an important question that has been raised.
Good, thank you very much for that. I see there's some other questions coming in. We've still got a few minutes before I go. Paul confirms that we need secure tenure of office. It's very essential and only attainable via Chapter 9. We've obviously seen that with the Scorpions being removed because there was no secure of their tenure in office. Just a quick one from Bash Teba says that Zizi Kodwa, for example, and the corruption involving EOH, where is the political will from the president on his appointment of the two ministries? It looks like an open question, but anyone can answer that.
So it's anyway. I think I'll leave that to Paul for a moment. I'm happy to participate in answering that question, Paul.
Sure. I mean, I think there's a whole lot of interesting things that have been spoken about. I might come back to that question in a bit. I mean, I think that what it says is I think that there's a lot of concern that the president is making decisions in the face of pretty clear evidence that we have of concerning conduct. And I think that runs through a lot of the decisions he's made, people he's appointed to the cabinet, even during the life of the Zondo Commission. Zondo was incredibly critical of certain appointments, where he said, I've had these people in front of me, they've clearly committed misconduct, why are you appointing them to these positions? And that was particularly true when he was speaking about the State Security Agency. He was very concerned about the way in which the findings, the conduct of the commission had been ignored in effect by the presidency. I think it is very worrying. I mean, in terms of, there's been a whole range of different things that are worth discussing. In terms of the education one, I think it's quite an interesting thing. I mean, I like the idea of, clearly I think it's important to explain, to include that sort of teaching in education at all levels about why corruption is problematic. But I think it needs to be grounded in a very clear sense, not just of sort of morality, because I think that can come across a bit pious, but looking at very real effects of what corruption does to societies and what corruption does in terms of its outcomes. And I think maybe it's time for us to start discussing, at certainly sort of higher levels of education, whether there should be a more consistent thematic focus on corruption as a driving force in South African history, and the way in which it has implicated or had impacts on the way in which our democratic status has developed over time. I think that'd be really interesting. In terms of a more practical thing, one of the recommendations of the Zondo Commission that I really thought was very powerful and very strong, and I sort of tried to indicate that in my own work on it, is that he suggested that there is some scope for the creation of a professional procurement officer as a vocation in South Africa. And I really like that idea, which is to create a position where there are actual courses that are offered at higher education or diploma studies you can do, which get you certified as a public procurement officer, totally conversant with all of the laws that you have to deal with, because I mean, I think what the Zondo Commission made very clear is that the web of laws around procurement are incredibly complicated. And he heard evidence on a number of occasions where there were well-meaning procurement officers or accounting officers who wanted to do something but didn't feel entirely comfortable that they understood the law well enough to intervene and overrule their political superiors. And he also recommended the creation of a sort of a bar society, like a professional body for procurement officials. And I really like that idea, because it's you create a body where you share best practice, you create incentives for good conduct, become a member of the board in the same way that a board of certified fraud examiners works. And also it has serious professional consequences, because if you are certified as a certified fraud examiner, for example, and that's removed from you, that has serious professional consequences. So I thought that was a very good proposal, and what that's sort of fallen off the radar a bit, but I think would address quite a few issues in a sort of a very granular level in the way procurement is done, but also create the space for like a much broader discussion about sort of the ethical and development of the procurement office.
Indeed. So we're coming to the end of our discussion. There's one more question posed to you, Paul, from Maddie Gray, just wanting to know who's the surname of Andrew that you mentioned. Is it Feinstein, if you can mention it?
Yes, yeah, that is Andrew Feinstein, who I've been working with for about 15 years now, which means we get on quite well, as you can imagine.
Excellent. So to close, I'd like you each just to give a 1 minute or 1.5 minutes, just your thoughts on where we are and to close the event. Thank you. Shall I call on you, Feroz?
By the way, Paul, if you'd convey my regards to Andrew, worked together in the provincial legislature for a while. I think we are on a journey, and we've just made a start. We're gonna have to roll up our sleeves, recognize the extent of corruption, which has become systemic and endemic. It represents a real threat to our democratic aspirations and developmental aspirations. So it's related to the broader questions about what kind of society we are and want to live in. I think that we should recognize that we will have advances and then reversals. We will make progress and then come to points where we feel that we're regressing. This is a long-term project. I think to embed an anti-democratic corruption agenda in our democratic institutions, and it's potentially then becomes a moment of some renewal, some renovation, some positioning of South Africa's 30-year-old democracy. So I think we're up for the struggle. We're up for this task. We have the resources, the resilience, the vision in this country to deal with this battle. So yeah, let's not let's not assume that let's not search for quick fixes and quick results. This is going to be a long-term battle.
Thank you, Feroz. Paul?
Sorry, I just realized that I was on mute there. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think I agree with Feroz. We are on a journey, but I think it's useful to look at this with quite a long historical perspective. I started my work on anti-corruption in South Africa back when I was much younger. I was 24, 25 at the time, and the arms deal was the thing that I focused on. And it is still one of the pieces of unfinished business in South African politics, and especially around corruption, that the arms deal has never been properly accounted for. It's people who are really guilty of corruption, and that deal never really went to jail, have faced proper consequences from it. But I think one of the ways where I think we can show that we've advanced and progressed when it comes to addressing these issues is that I was imagining, what would it be like if we had a discussion about the arms deal now, because of various factors, including the pushback against it. I would have to have a conversation proving to people that the arms deal was corrupt, which is a pretty insane thing to have to say when, after 2 books and multiple pieces of evidence put out to the public domain, but it's still a contested idea that this incredibly corrupt deal was corrupt. Whereas I think on state capture, we've moved beyond that. I mean, I don't think there's anybody realistically who anybody takes with any degree of seriousness who will deny that state capture existed, that it happened, that we know some of the key players behind it. And that in and of itself, I think, is a major advance for our society. I think we've shortcut a very long process where you can't get accountability when you don't even have a sense of what people need to be accountable for. And we have that now. So we have, through the Zondo Commission, we have a bedrock of facts, of evidence. And it's from there that we could start making serious changes, seeking accountability, but also planning our way forward in future. And I think that means that we're in a much better place than we were. I mean, I certainly feel that as an activist myself, but I'm in a much better place around these issues than we ever were around the arms deal. And that has to be a positive thing. So even though it is a long fight, and even though we have a lot to do, I think that we've achieved one thing already, which is that we've got that agreement that something happened and something needs to be done about it.
Exactly. For my part, having been a person who gave testimony at the Zondo Commission and attended many of the events there, I was there almost every day just listening, is that it highlighted and focused on the corruption in our country, the systemic and endemic, and how deep and wide the corruption went. That was the one part. The second, that it brought out the awareness that while we as normal citizens were carrying on with our careers, our jobs, our families, this was going on behind us and around us. And we felt that government would take care of it, but they didn't. And so I think the third point for me that came out strongly with the Zondo Commission was that it had put that evidence out to everyone to access. There's the websites, there's the of the Zondo Commission, there's the publications now. And for us now as citizens, we cannot turn a blind eye, and that we all need to play a role in South Africa of how do we now make this a better South Africa and leave a better South Africa for our children and our future generation, grandchildren, and leave this legacy. So for me, I think it was a positive thing that the Zondo Commission happened. I am very, as I said, I feel very much part of it, and I feel that it's something that will take us to a future now of how do we make decisions and how do we hold people accountable. Thank you, Paul, for being on this webinar today. Thank you, Firoz. And thank you to all the participants for your questions and for participating and adding your comments. And have a good evening. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.